Some people walk into a room, and reality seems to bend around them. Opportunities appear. People listen closely. Respect follows naturally. Even rejection seems to affect them differently. And others quietly wonder, what do they have that I don't? According to Carl Jung, the answer is often far deeper than confidence, charm, or intelligence alone. Because human beings respond not only to words, but to psychological energy, to emotional certainty, to unconscious signals, to the relationship a person has with themselves internally. And this is why some individuals consistently attract what they want, while others constantly chase it without success. The difference is rarely desperation versus effort. It is inner alignment versus inner conflict. Carl Jung believed people unconsciously communicate far more than they consciously realize. Fear communicates. Neediness communicates. Self-rejection communicates. Inner certainty communicates too. And most social dynamics happen beneath conscious awareness entirely. This means people often feel your relationship with yourself before they fully process your words. A person deeply uncomfortable with themselves unconsciously broadcasts tension. They seek approval constantly, over-explain themselves, fear rejection excessively, adapt too quickly for acceptance. And paradoxically, the more desperately someone seeks validation externally, the less psychologically powerful they appear. Because desperation signals lack internally, lack of worth, lack of stability, lack of inner security. This is why people who try too hard often struggle socially, romantically, and professionally despite effort. Their energy says, I need something from you to feel complete. And human beings instinctively feel this. Carl Jung understood that unconscious insecurity shapes behavior constantly. A person may appear confident externally, while internally fearing rejection, abandonment, invisibility, not being enough. And these fears subtly influence every interaction. Tone changes, body language changes, emotional presence changes, because the psyche cannot fully hide its internal state. This is why genuine confidence feels different from performance. Performance seeks validation. Real confidence does not desperately need it. And perhaps this is one of the biggest psychological differences between people who consistently get what they want and people who struggle endlessly for approval. They are not emotionally chasing. They are grounded. This does not mean they never feel fear or insecurity. It means they are not controlled by those feelings unconsciously. Carl Jung believed psychological power emerges when individuals integrate the shadow instead of being ruled by it invisibly. The shadow includes insecurity, fear, jealousy, shame, anger, emotional wounds. Most people spend enormous energy trying to hide these parts of themselves. But suppression creates fragmentation. The person becomes divided internally. One part performs confidence. Another part secretly feels unworthy. And human beings unconsciously detect this inner conflict. This is why forced confidence rarely feels magnetic. It feels tense, because underneath the performance lives fear. But people who possess real psychological presence usually have something different. Self-acceptance, not perfection. Acceptance. They are no longer at war with themselves constantly. And this creates calmness. A calmness many people mistake for natural charisma. But often, it is simply psychological congruence. Their external behavior matches their internal reality more closely. Carl Jung believed wholeness creates power, not dominance, not manipulation. Wholeness, because a person no longer fragmented by constant self-rejection becomes emotionally stable in a way others instinctively trust. This changes social dynamics profoundly. People respond differently to individuals who do not desperately seek approval, tolerate rejection calmly, remain emotionally centered, speak authentically, possess inner direction, are comfortable with themselves. Because these qualities signal psychological safety and strength unconsciously. And strength is attractive far beyond physical appearance or status. Not aggressive strength, grounded strength, the kind that does not need to constantly prove itself. This is why people who always get what they want often appear strangely relaxed, even under pressure, because internally, their self-worth is not entirely dependent on the outcome. And that changes everything. Most people become emotionally attached to results. If this person rejects me, I lose value. If I fail, I lose worth. If I'm not chosen, I become insignificant. This attachment creates fear, and fear creates tension. But psychologically grounded individuals understand something deeper. Rejection does not define identity. Failure does not erase worth. And because they are less terrified of loss, they move through life differently, more freely, more authentically, more decisively. Carl Jung believed fear of rejection controls enormous amounts of human behavior unconsciously. People hide opinions, hide emotions, hide authenticity, all to protect belonging. But the more someone abandons themselves for acceptance, the weaker their psychological presence becomes, because unconscious self-rejection always leaks outward eventually. This is why authenticity has such unusual power socially. Not performative authenticity, real authenticity. The willingness to exist without constantly editing yourself for approval. And ironically, this often attracts far more respect, because human beings instinctively admire people who appear psychologically whole. Not perfect, whole. People who know who they are internally tend to influence environments naturally, not through force, through emotional certainty. Carl Jung understood that individuals disconnected from themselves unconsciously seek direction from external validation. But individuals connected to themselves create direction internally. And this creates magnetism, because uncertainty seeks certainty. Chaos seeks groundedness. People gravitate toward individuals who feel emotionally anchored in themselves, especially in a world where most people are deeply disconnected internally. This is why people who always get what they want often possess one quality others underestimate completely. They are not trying to become worthy in every interaction. They already carry an internal sense of worth before the interaction even begins. And that internal relationship with the self changes reality more than most people realize. And this is where most people misunderstand influence completely. They think power comes from status, appearance, manipulation, dominance, saying the perfect thing. But according to Carl Jung, human beings respond most deeply to unconscious psychological signals, to emotional congruence, to the invisible relationship a person has with themselves internally. This is why two people can say the exact same words, yet create completely different reactions. One feels magnetic, the other feels uncertain. Because communication is never only verbal. Fear communicates, desperation communicates, neediness communicates, inner stability communicates too. And perhaps the most powerful trait people who consistently get what they want possess is emotional non-desperation. They want things, but they are not psychologically destroyed by the possibility of not getting them. That distinction changes everything. Most people unconsciously approach life from emotional scarcity. Scarcity of love, scarcity of validation, scarcity of worth. So every interaction becomes loaded with pressure. Every rejection feels catastrophic. Every silence feels personal. Every failure feels like proof of inadequacy. And this emotional intensity creates unconscious tension. Carl Jung understood that whatever a person desperately avoids psychologically often begins controlling them unconsciously. This includes fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of being unseen, fear of insignificance. The more terrified someone is of these experiences, the more reactive they become emotionally. And emotional reactivity weakens psychological presence, because now the individual is no longer acting freely. They are acting defensively, trying to secure approval, trying to avoid discomfort, trying to control perception constantly. But people who consistently attract opportunities, respect, influence, and connection often move differently psychologically, not because life is easier for them, because they are less internally controlled by fear. This creates calmness under pressure, a calmness many people mistake for luck or natural charisma. But Jung would argue that this calmness often emerges from individuation, the process of becoming psychologically integrated. Because integrated people stop needing constant external confirmation to feel real internally. And that changes the energy of every interaction. They stop over-explaining themselves, stop chasing approval aggressively, stop collapsing emotionally after rejection. Not because they lack emotion, because their identity is no longer entirely dependent on external response. This creates freedom, and freedom is magnetic. Human beings instinctively feel when someone is emotionally free versus emotionally dependent. Emotionally dependent individuals unconsciously seek validation from others constantly. Their mood shifts based on approval. Their confidence shifts based on attention. Their identity shifts based on acceptance. But emotionally grounded individuals carry stability within themselves. And this stability creates trust. Because people naturally feel safer around those who appear psychologically anchored. Carl Jung believed unresolved, unconscious wounds create compensatory behaviors. For example, insecurity may become arrogance. Shame may become perfectionism. Fear may become control. Loneliness may become attention-seeking. This is why many people who appear confident actually feel exhausting to be around. Their confidence is performance, and performance requires constant maintenance. But people who truly possess psychological depth often feel calmer, quieter sometimes, more emotionally centered, because they are not trying to convince others of their worth every moment. And paradoxically, this often increases their influence dramatically, because emotional certainty affects environments unconsciously. When someone deeply trusts themselves internally, others often begin trusting them too. This is why some individuals naturally command respect without forcing it. They do not chase authority aggressively. Their presence communicates stability already. Carl Jung understood that people project constantly. They project strength onto grounded individuals, project confidence onto emotionally integrated individuals, project value onto those who appear self-valuing. Because human beings unconsciously mirror psychological signals. This means your relationship with yourself silently teaches people how to relate to you. If you constantly self-reject internally, others often feel that instability unconsciously. If you tolerate disrespect repeatedly, people sense weak boundaries. If you fear abandonment intensely, you may unconsciously overgive, overplease, or overpursue. And these behaviors reduce psychological attraction because they communicate, I do not fully believe I am enough. But individuals who consistently get what they want often understand something profound. Neediness repels, not because desire itself is wrong, because desperation communicates dependence, and dependence creates pressure psychologically. This applies to relationships, friendships, careers, influence, leadership. The more emotionally dependent someone becomes on a specific outcome, the more tension enters their behavior. Carl Jung believed attachment often reveals unconscious wounds, especially attachment rooted in identity. If I lose this person, I lose myself. If I fail here, I become worthless. If I'm rejected, I become invisible. These beliefs create emotional instability. But psychologically grounded individuals separate outcomes from identity. They pursue goals intensely, without allowing those goals to determine their entire sense of worth. And this creates resilience, because now rejection becomes information instead of annihilation. Failure becomes experience instead of identity collapse. This is why some people recover quickly from setbacks, while others spiral emotionally for years. The difference is often internal structure. One person's identity is built entirely on external success. Another person's identity exists deeper than temporary outcomes. Carl Jung believed true strength emerges when the self becomes rooted internally instead of externally. And once this happens, the person stops moving through life from fear. Now they move from alignment. from inner direction, from self-trust. And strangely, this often causes reality itself to respond differently to them. Because reality responds differently to people who are psychologically aligned. Not magically, energetically, socially, emotionally. Human beings are constantly reacting to unconscious signals beneath awareness. And people who consistently get what they want often understand something others never fully realize. The mind unconsciously shapes presence. A person consumed by self-doubt moves differently, speaks differently, chooses differently, even desires differently. Fear narrows behavior. It makes people hesitate, overthink, seek permission, avoid risk, suppress authenticity. And over time, this creates a life organized around psychological protection instead of expansion. Carl Jung believed unconscious fear limits human potential far more than external obstacles alone. Because what people believe about themselves internally determines how they interact with the world externally. Someone who unconsciously believes, "I am not enough," will often sabotage opportunities before failure even occurs. Not intentionally. Psychologically, they may avoid visibility, fear success, settle for less, tolerate poor treatment, shrink themselves socially, remain silent when they should speak, because deep down, they do not fully believe they deserve more. And this is why self-worth changes reality so profoundly. Not because confidence creates fantasy, because self-perception alters behavior, and behavior alters outcomes. Carl Jung understood that people constantly project their unconscious beliefs outward. Someone ashamed internally may assume rejection everywhere. Someone emotionally insecure may interpret neutrality as criticism. Someone disconnected from themselves may become obsessed with external validation. And without awareness, the person becomes trapped inside unconscious patterns repeating endlessly. This is why some people remain stuck despite intelligence, talent, or effort. Their unconscious identity contradicts what they consciously desire. Consciously, they want love, success, visibility, influence, abundance. But unconsciously, they fear exposure, failure, responsibility, rejection, judgment. And the unconscious mind often wins these internal conflicts. Because human beings move most powerfully from what they emotionally believe, not merely what they intellectually want. This is why people who consistently get what they want usually possess deep internal permission. Permission to take up space, speak clearly, desire openly, fail without collapsing, be visible, trust themselves. Most people never realize how much energy they waste asking the world for permission psychologically. Permission to exist confidently, permission to feel worthy, permission to pursue what they truly want. And this constant self-questioning weakens presence, because uncertainty communicates itself unconsciously. Carl Jung believed individuation requires separating identity from collective approval. The psychologically integrated person stops building themselves entirely around external validation. Now they are guided internally. And this creates extraordinary power, because externally driven people become emotionally controlled by circumstances constantly. Praise lifts them, criticism destroys them, rejection destabilizes them. But internally grounded people remain more stable across changing circumstances. And stability creates influence. This is why some individuals feel naturally powerful without dominating others. Their nervous systems are calmer. Their decisions are clearer. Their energy feels less fragmented. Because internally, they are no longer divided against themselves constantly. Carl Jung understood that fragmentation weakens psychological force. When one part of the self desires success, while another part fears visibility, the psyche experiences conflict, and conflict drains energy. This is why many people feel exhausted pursuing goals. Their conscious desires and unconscious fears are fighting each other continuously. One part says, "Go forward." Another says, "Hide." One part seeks love. Another fears intimacy. One part seeks greatness. Another fears judgment. And until these contradictions become conscious, the person remains psychologically split. But integrated individuals possess congruence. Their inner world and outer behavior align more closely. And congruence creates magnetism, because human beings trust coherence instinctively. This does not mean psychologically powerful people are perfect. It means they are less fragmented internally, less dependent on masks, less desperate for approval, less terrified of rejection. And perhaps this is why they appear so calm, while others seem emotionally reactive, because they are not trying to control every outcome to preserve their identity. They already possess identity internally. Carl Jung believed many people chase power externally because they feel powerless within themselves. So they seek status, validation, admiration, control, attention, hoping these things will finally create inner stability. But external power without inner grounding creates insecurity. The person becomes addicted to approval because approval temporarily silences inner emptiness. And this is why some highly successful individuals still feel deeply fragile psychologically. Their self-worth depends entirely on external reinforcement. But people who consistently attract opportunities and respect often possess a quieter kind of power. Self-possession, the ability to remain connected to themselves regardless of temporary outcomes. And this changes how they move through life. Now rejection becomes survivable. Failure becomes temporary. Criticism becomes information instead of identity collapse. And because they are no longer emotionally paralyzed by fear, they take action more freely, speak more honestly, lead more naturally, create more boldly. This is why courage often looks like confidence from the outside. But psychologically, courage is usually the willingness to act despite uncertainty. And uncertainty terrifies people disconnected from themselves internally. Because without inner grounding, external instability feels unbearable. But psychologically integrated individuals trust something deeper. Not that life will always go perfectly, but that they can handle life without abandoning themselves internally. And maybe that is the real reason some people consistently get what they want. Not because the world favors them unfairly, but because they stop being ruled entirely by fear. And perhaps that is the hidden difference most people never notice. The people who consistently attract opportunities, respect, influence, love, and success are not always the most talented, not always the smartest, not always the most attractive, not always the most perfect, but psychologically, they are often the least divided against themselves. According to Carl Jung, inner conflict weakens human energy profoundly, because when the psyche is fragmented, enormous energy becomes trapped internally. One part seeks connection, another fears vulnerability. One part desires success, another fears visibility. One part wants freedom, another clings to safety. And this internal contradiction creates hesitation, overthinking, self-sabotage, emotional inconsistency. The individual keeps stopping themselves unconsciously before life even has the chance to respond. But psychologically integrated people move differently. Not because fear disappears completely, because fear no longer controls every decision. This creates decisiveness, and decisiveness changes reality. People trust decisive individuals more, follow decisive individuals more, respect decisive individuals more, because certainty is emotionally stabilizing in a deeply uncertain world. Carl Jung believed individuation transforms people because it reconnects them to their authentic center. Now the person no longer depends entirely on external approval to feel real internally. And this creates enormous psychological freedom. Because freedom changes behavior, the individual stops over-explaining, chasing validation, shape-shifting for acceptance, begging for recognition, fearing rejection constantly. And ironically, this often makes them far more attractive socially. Because human beings instinctively admire self-possession, the ability to remain connected to yourself without collapsing under external pressure. And maybe this is why emotionally grounded individuals often seem strangely magnetic. Not because they are trying to impress people, because they are psychologically present. Most people are not fully present. They are trapped in anxiety, performance, insecurity, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of rejection. Their nervous systems are constantly reacting, but integrated individuals create calm, and calm creates influence. Carl Jung understood that people unconsciously seek stability in others because most individuals feel fragmented internally themselves. So when someone appears emotionally centered, authentic, grounded, internally directed, people naturally feel drawn toward that energy because certainty feels safe. Not rigid certainty, inner certainty, the kind that says, I know who I am even if not everyone approves. That is rare psychologically. Most people build identity around reaction. They feel worthy when praised, unworthy when criticized, powerful when admired, invisible when ignored. So their emotional state becomes controlled by the external world constantly. But psychologically powerful individuals build identity internally first. And this changes everything. Now they can pursue goals without desperation, love without losing themselves, lead without dominating, speak without constant fear of judgment, because their worth no longer depends entirely on outcomes. And perhaps this is the real secret behind people who consistently get what they want. They are not psychologically begging life for permission to exist fully. They already decided internally they are allowed to take up space, allowed to desire more, allowed to be visible, allowed to fail without self-destruction, allowed to pursue life without endless apology. This creates momentum because fear stops paralyzing action constantly. Carl Jung believed the unconscious mind becomes dangerous when ignored. Unconscious shame creates insecurity. Unconscious fear creates avoidance. Unconscious self-hatred creates self-sabotage. But once these forces become conscious, the individual begins reclaiming power from them, not through domination, through awareness, because awareness weakens unconscious control. And maybe that is the deeper lesson here. The people who consistently attract what they want are often not controlling reality more than others. They are controlling themselves less through fear. They trust themselves more deeply, trust their voice, trust their instincts, trust their ability to survive rejection, uncertainty, and failure without losing themselves entirely. And this trust creates freedom. Freedom creates authenticity. Authenticity creates presence. Presence creates influence. That is the psychological chain most people never see. So stop asking, how do I force people to value me? And start asking, what parts of me still believe I am unworthy without external validation? Because that question reveals the real psychological barrier. Not lack of talent, not lack of intelligence. Fear. The fear that you are not enough without constant approval. And once that fear begins losing power, your entire relationship with life changes. Now you stop chasing from emptiness. You begin creating from wholeness. And people feel that difference immediately. So if you've spent years shrinking yourself, fearing rejection, overthinking every interaction, needing constant validation, doubting your worth constantly, understand this clearly. Your power was never meant to come from performance. It comes from psychological alignment, from no longer abandoning yourself internally. And if something in this felt deeply familiar, don't ignore it. Write it simply. I stop chasing. I start becoming. Not as motivation, as transformation. And if you're ready to explore deeper psychology, shadow work, self-worth, emotional power, authenticity, individuation, and the unconscious mind, stay with inner Phoria. Because the moment you stop needing the world to complete you is often the moment the world begins responding to you differently.